Hey there, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about something that my husband and I do, and we think it can be a really great path to homeownership. We think it's a really great way to go, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about house hacking today and what it is, why it might be right for you, and mistakes I see people make when it comes to house hacking. For a little bit of a background, my husband and I house hack our dream home. Our dream home is about 2,300 square feet on half an acre in Yakima, Washington. We have a pool. Our home is all on one level. We have a primary suite. It's all the things we wanted in a home. More on that another day. And we also have an accessory dwelling unit across the driveway that's a 1 bed, 1 bath with a 2-car garage. We lived in that for the first 2 years we lived in our home while we were completely gutting and renovating it. And then after that first 2 years, we moved over to the bigger house, the dream home house, and then we rented that one out. So we know a little bit about it. Originally, when we were looking for our home, we were looking for duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. And then we actually, it's a long story for another video, but we actually stumbled across this and it was an even better situation for us in the long term. So house hacking is when you buy a home with multiple units and you live in one of the units and then you rent out one of the others. Other options for house hacking are buying a single family home and renting out bedrooms to friends or tenants, more of like a communal living kind of situation. That's one way to do it as well. And it really might be a great choice for you. One of the reasons I really like it is because it can really help offset the cost of homeownership, especially when you're a first-time home buyer, first-time homeowner, property owner. It can be very hard to grasp that the mortgage that you are paying is actually the least amount of money you will pay that month. Versus rent is the most amount of money you will pay that month. Any repairs or maintenance are the responsibility of the landlord. So you're supposed to be able to call up, hey, this thing is broken, please come fix it, and it's supposed to come and get fixed. Now, I know some of you are gonna jump in the comments and say, my landlord never responds to me. This isn't what we're talking about today, but that sucks. But if you're an ethical landlord, you should be doing those things. Now, as a homeowner, the mortgage and your insurance and your property taxes is the least amount of money you will pay, because then you always have improvements, maintenance, repairs, anything like that. So having extra income coming in as a result of this investment is a huge way to offset that period of not knowing how to get into that and not knowing how to manage that. Now, this only works if you are not completely dependent on that rental money, and I'm going to get more into that later, but it can really help offset and give you more flexibility in your budget. Number 2 is it's a great entry into investing and being a landlord. Specifically, I like to look at this from the ethical standpoint of being an investor and a landlord. Would you be willing to live in the units that you are renting out? As a house hacker, usually the answer to that is yes. I am bringing these units up to a standard that I would find acceptable to me because I am living in one of them. And that's a really important distinction here to make. And I think house hackers end up becoming some of the best landlords and investors because they really take a lot of pride in making sure that the home is up to a certain level and a certain standard. If they wouldn't be willing to live in it, they are not going to ask you to live in it. And I think that's a great way to get good entry into it. Also lowers the bar and the barrier for entry from a cost perspective, because instead of putting down 15 to 20% as you would on most investment loans, you can actually put as little as 0% down if you're VA and as little as 3.5% if you're FHA for up to 4 units. So you can actually get into for a much lower cost than you would on a normal investment property. And that's something that's really exciting. It's also a really steady and reliable way to build a portfolio. Technically, you can get a new house hack every single year. You have to live in the property as a primary residence for 1 year, and then you can refinance that, do another FHA loan or another VA loan, and you can get another property. So you can do this every year if you would like. Now, that's maybe not what I would recommend. I'll get more into that later, but you can do it at a very steady and reliable pace. If you're buying a property knowing that you're going to go in, you're maybe going to improve it a little bit to where it would afford higher rents, especially after you maybe renovate the unit that you're living in, and then you can get more rents when you move out. That then becomes income for you to be able to qualify for your next property. So it could be a really steady and reliable way to do that in a systematic way that lets you not get too big for your britches too quickly. when it comes to investing. The other one is that it offers flexibility that normal home ownership can't. Having rent come in on my primary residence is a huge weight off of my budget. It gives me flexibility. It gives me passive income that I am not necessarily working a full-time job for. It's not an equal exchange of time spent and money earned. So it does give me a lot of flexibility. Now, where it's going to offer me the most flexibility in my particular residence is that once my mortgage is paid off here, all of the rent from that will actually pay for my household, for me to live here. My property taxes, my insurance, my utilities will all be covered by the rent from that ADU. So it gives me flexibility for retirement as well, because I do not need to have investment income to cover those costs. I don't need to have pension income. My husband works a government job. He doesn't need to have pension income to cover those costs. Those costs can be covered by the rent from that unit. So when we're looking at how much money do we need to retire, we can actually do those numbers a little bit differently with this home in our retirement plans. Now I want to talk a little bit about mistakes that I see people make when they're house hacking, because this is something I can see get really icky or go really sideways really fast. So I want to talk a little bit about that before I close out this video. I see a lot of people buying more than they could afford on their own with a house hack, just because you can use the rental income from the other units that you won't be living in towards your debt to income ratio. So for example, a duplex, say it's listed at $700,000 and the rent from the other side is great. Let's say it's $2,500 and you're getting great rent from that other side. So you're able to qualify for it with your normal income because the rent from that other side that will become your income is helping you afford that. What happens with an unexpected and early vacancy? What happens if the renter stays in the home and doesn't pay rent? There are things to consider there. If you buy too much for you to afford to absorb into your budget as a house hack, especially the first time around, you will get burned. So be very cognizant of, even though you're buying a house hack, which gives you a little bit more buying power, you need to make sure you don't go too expensive too quickly, because you want to make sure you have enough reserves. You want to make sure you have enough flexibility in your budget that you can withstand and weather a storm. When we bought this home, we knew we were getting the little house first, and we actually lived in the big house just in a mattress on the floor for the first couple of months because the gutting of that house actually took longer than we expected. And then we actually had to do some electrical work on this house because it was a fire hazard. So we had to do some electrical work over here once we moved over to that house. We were not able to rent out the big house here when we first bought this property. I think for the first 4 months it was. And if we couldn't afford the mortgage without the rents coming in on our own, that would have been devastating. And you never know when those kinds of things are going to come up. So because we could afford the mortgage on our own, we were able to absorb that into our budget. It was not a burden on us. I mean, it wasn't ideal, but it was not a burden on us to still afford the mortgage. And we knew once we lived in the little house, the big house was going to bring in a really good amount of rent. And so it was a great situation. We had the budget to withstand it. If we didn't, that could have been devastating to us as first-time home buyers. So just be really cognizant of that. The other thing that I see a lot of people do is not having a big enough emergency fund. You have to realize that your emergency fund is no longer just about you and about your household within your four walls. You need to understand that your emergency fund is actually a lot of people dependent on it besides you. So you need to have a plan in place to be able to withstand that. If you have a 3-month emergency fund on your own for you prior to you buying the property, you probably you're going to need to up it because your costs are probably going up, and you need to figure the costs not with the rental income in there. So for example, even though let's say your mortgage is $3,000 and you're getting $1,500 a month in rent, when you're figuring your 3 to 6 month emergency fund, you're using the figure of $3,000. You're not using the figure of the $1,500 minus the rent. Does that make sense? So you want to make sure you're doing things that make sense. One of the last things that I see people doing is I see people get too aggressive or try scaling too quickly with house hacking. So they'll do house hack year after year after year on exactly the year dot. And what happens is they stop getting reserves in line for each of those units. So you get a lot of people who they have one emergency fund, and yeah, that's fine. But I highly recommend as you start scaling and doing multiple house hacks, you actually have an emergency fund for each property, and that you have that money set aside. It is there, and you do not allow yourself to get into the next property until you have that. Enough to cover vacancy, enough to cover a major repair, anything like that. So making sure you're not scaling too quickly, that you could not absorb an issue. And remember, more money, more units, more problems. The more units you have, the more likely things are to come up. So you need to be a little bit more conservative as you're starting to scale that business, that you are not overextending your monthly finances and you're not becoming too dependent on rental income. You are not overspending on that money and you're becoming very reliant on that income. You really, instead of budgeting at 100% of that income, you need to be budgeting more at 50 to 60% of that income when it comes to those expenses. So be more conservative and don't scale too quickly if you're going to do some house hacking. So that is just a little bit about the basics of house hacking. I have so much more to share. Been through it with clients many times, really enjoying house hacking our dream home right now. Have a lot more to share on that front. So thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope to be able to teach you more about house hacking, investing, and building your wealth. Talk to you soon.